Afghanistan is a victim of its geography as well as of its history.
I suppose Afghanistan in some ways is like a sort of Switzerland of Asia. It's a small mountainous country in the middle of Asia. But whereas in Switzerland and Europe the battles went round Switzerland, in Afghanistan the battles had to go through, because Afghanistan stood astride the main route into India.
Afghanistan has been a highway for conquerors, at the same time a crossroad of civilizations and religions, and a roundabout of trade routes.
The country's strategic position on the ancient Silk Route, which linked the trade of China, Rome and India, meant that it was repeatedly fought over despite its rugged terrain.
The different ethnic groups in Afghanistan are really a product of history, of these armies travelling through. Several of them, for example, the Uzbeks in the north and the Hazaras in the central, are the remnants of different invading armies.
This ethnic diversity has led to centuries of tribal conflict, but it's the past 26 years of revolution, occupation and civil war which have made Afghanistan one of the poorest countries in the world.
Despite all the invasions and the tribal wars, the one thing that does unite the Afghans is their violent hatred of foreign domination. More than 2,000 years ago, Alexander the Great, the king of Macedon, was one of the first to try and conquer it.
He swept right over, in through Turkey first of all, then through Persia, and then chased the last of the Persian emperors up into northern Afghanistan.
Afghanistan at that time had no central power, and it looked as an easy passage for him. But when he started his stride, it took him 4 years to get rid of problems in Afghanistan.
By the time he was 30, Alexander had conquered most of the known world, including the warlike tribes of what is now Afghanistan, who are a constant thorn in his side. He died on his way home, still only 32.
While Alexander the Great's empire didn't survive his death by much, his cultural legacy lived on for a long time.
In the northern parts, in the villages, in the remote parts of northern Pakistan and Afghanistan, people still remember Alexander the Great. He's still a name to conjure with after all those centuries and years.
Not only did he win battles, but he brought with him in his baggage train Greek civilization.
One of the results was the art of Gandhara, a blend of Greek and Indian culture which emerged several centuries later and led to the first representation of the Buddha in human form. The humanization of the Buddhas reached its climax most dramatically in the two colossal statues carved in the mountainside at Bamiyan in the 4th and 5th centuries AD. Bamiyan attracted pilgrims from all over Asia, who in turn spread the Buddhist message far and wide.
200 years later, as Islam spread across Afghanistan, the Buddhas remained untouched. Even when Genghis Khan, the Mongol conqueror,
And his army, the atom bomb of their day, arrived in 1221,
the Buddhas gazed down impassively as his troops massacred every living creature in the valley before he marched on to the west and further conquest.
He had formed a very effective army of cavalry men, well organized, tough, on small horses, and they swept across the rest of Asia. They swept into Central Asia, they swept down into Iran, they swept into Afghanistan, they swept right over into Russia under Genghis Khan's sons and grandsons. Genghis Khan himself lived to see his empire, probably one of the biggest in extent the world has ever known. And he did it pretty ruthlessly too. If people surrendered to him, that was fine, but if they didn't surrender, he would flatten the cities and kill everyone in it.
The Mongol invasion of Afghanistan resulted in devastating destruction and purposeless and passionless cruelty, destruction of agriculture, and pushed people towards nomadism.
For centuries to come, Afghanistan was to be the victim of many more invasions by foreign conquerors.
About 200 years later, there was another great world conqueror, a famous one, Tamerlane, who caused terror even in Europe. He went through Afghanistan, causing destruction. He was famous for building up pyramids of skulls of the people he had killed. And then, about 100 years later, there was a much more benign conqueror who came down the area. This was the Emperor Babur, the first of the Mughal emperors. He was actually a lovely man, as we know from his diaries, because he was interested in everything, in the birds, in the costumes, in the music, and so on, and the paintings, and places where he passed. And that was a period of great luxury and sophistication. When the Mughal Empire became rather weak, and the Persian Safavid Empire, which had also struggled between them for Afghanistan, also became weak. And there was a period of sort of chaos. And in fact, in that situation of chaos, a Persian general emerged called Nadir Shah.
But within the decade, Nadir Shah had been assassinated, and his guard commander, Ahmad Shah Durrani, an Afghan, had taken over. In 1747, he was crowned, and for the first time, Afghanistan had become an independent country.
Of course, it was in this period that the power structures in the world changed. The great land empires, like the Mughals and like the Safavids in Iran and like the Ottoman Empire, became less strong, while the colonial empires developed their sea power around the world. And it was the beginning of the domination by Europe of the world, really.
Too sympathetic to the Russians. Instead, they decided to install the ex-king Shah Shuja as a British puppet supported by British bayonets. But at home, the Duke of Wellington and many other eminent soldiers and statesmen opposed the war, prophesying shame and defeat. Nevertheless, the order was given to march. It was to prove a disastrous decision.
People in Delhi and London had an idea of what was called a forward policy. They thought they should establish security beyond India's borders. You could put in modern parlance a sort of preemptive policy. But it was very badly planned, badly worked out.
Once installed, the new king was to prove hugely unpopular. The British envoy was assassinated, and worse still, General Elphinstone, whom the British had appointed to command in Kabul, was senile, ill, and indecisive, dithering his way to a terrible defeat. The deep resentment Afghans felt for the foreign occupier welled up in a savage hatred that was to show no mercy. The British withdrew from Kabul in the dead of winter. They travelled across snowbound passes without food or proper clothing, continually ambushed and sniped at by tribesmen. The withdrawal soon turned into a rout. Stragglers who escaped being ambushed or shot down like rabbits starved or froze to death. Despite the almost total breakdown of discipline, many died bravely, fighting to the bitter end, most famously at Gandamak, where the British made a heroic last stand.
On January the 13th, 1842, a lone horseman stumbled into the British Army camp at Jalalabad. Of the 16,000 soldiers and camp followers who left Kabul, he was the only one to escape death or capture. His name was Dr. William Brydon, and for the rest of his life, he was to be known as the last man. It was the worst defeat ever suffered by the British Army. A seemingly invincible force was outmaneuvered and finally cut to pieces by what was seen as a motley horde of turbaned tribesmen. When the news of the defeat reached London, Victorian Britain was horrified and shocked.
The forward policy was abandoned, and the British said, all right, we'll have nothing to do with Afghanistan. They allowed Dost Muhammad to go back as king. And then for a period of about 30 years, the British sort of kept their hands off. They watched the Russians, but they didn't interfere until it came to the time of the Second Afghan War.
Only 36 years later, Britain's need for security and fears of Russian expansionism led to a second invasion of Afghanistan.
The lessons of history can be forgotten soon by any government and any individual. But I don't think the British didn't learn a lot. They wanted a brief intervention. They wanted to stop Russian
By 1878, the British were once again worried about Russian influence, and they had more reason at this time because Dost Muhammad's successor and son was intriguing with the Russians, and in fact it was found out later that he'd signed a secret treaty with them. So the British were very angry. They moved some forces into the southern part of Afghanistan, and they insisted that the Amir of Afghanistan accept a British mission and that he accepted British control over his foreign policy.
History was to repeat itself. The Afghans showed what they thought of the treaty by assassinating the British envoy. Soon afterwards, General Roberts, the ablest commander in India, fought his way into Kabul, crushed all the opposition in the city, and ruled with a rod of iron.
In the south, meanwhile, another British army was being overwhelmed at Maiwand, near Kandahar. On hearing of the defeat, General Roberts' army made a forced march of over 300 miles from Kabul to win a decisive victory that ended the Second Anglo-Afghan War.
It cost both sides much blood and money. In the end, apart from British honour, little else was satisfied. Except perhaps for Bobby the dog. Owned by Sergeant Kelly, Bobby survived the Afghan campaign despite being wounded at Maiwand. On his return to England in 1881, he was decorated with his own special Afghan War Medal by Her Imperial Majesty Queen Victoria herself. Nothing much changed for the next 50 years until in 1919 the Afghans, believing that Britain was losing control in India, launched an attack across the northwest frontier. The war was short and sharp, ending abruptly when the RAF bombed Kabul and Jalalabad. The peace treaty was signed in 1921, not only ending the third and last Anglo-Afghan war, but giving Afghanistan full independence for the first time, an independence that was to last until the Soviet invasion of 1979.
The British at that time didn't want any fuss. They were exhausted after the First World War, and they were very happy to let the Afghans run their own affairs and have complete independence. So Amanullah then became the king, and Amanullah was a strange character, an important character in Afghan history, because he wanted to make Afghanistan a modern, secular state. But he was very much in advance of his time.
What you can see is different attempts towards changing Afghanistan and transforming the country into a modern country. The first attempts by the king was toppled by tribal revolts.
He got his wife to appear in public and take the veil off, and then he tried to persuade all the people to dress in Western clothes. They finally rebelled. They said enough is enough. He was thrown off the throne, sent into exile, and the country was in chaos.
Peace was restored in 1929, and the country survived for 50 years as a more or less benevolent monarchy, until the king was deposed by his cousin and former prime minister.
Prince Dawood was a key figure in Afghanistan. He was a dynamic, tough character who was a modernizer, didn't brook any opposition.
Dawood, who was the cousin of the king, in alliance with a number of leftist officers who were educated in the Soviet Union, decided to topple the monarchy and establish the first republic in Afghanistan. It was a bloodless coup.
Dawood then tried to break from his communists, to break